Welcome, everyone. This is Bill Lester here, and in this section, we're going to talk about a very common plant pests that many of you have probably never even heard of before, which are nematodes. So, we're going to cover exactly what nematodes are, give some examples of common and some uncommon nematodes, and then discuss agriculturally important nematodes, a few of the different species, the kind of host plants that they'll feed upon, the signs and symptoms, basically the damage that they do to plants, the thresholds, and then a little bit about how to use the University of Florida Nematode Assay Lab. Nematodes make up an entire phylum of the animal kingdom. There's several different classes and many different orders of nematodes. There's about 15,000 different species described, but it's one of those organisms that's not very well studied, and scientists believe that there may be as many as 1 million different species, many of which we haven't discovered or described yet. Basically, what they are is microscopic, soft-bodied, unsegmented roundworms. Now, not all of them are microscopic. Some of them are a little bit larger, but most of the ones that we're going to deal with that are plant pests are microscopic. Nematodes have adapted to be able to live in just about every kind of habitat. Some species live in the water, they're marine nematodes. They can live in brackish water, fresh water, even salt water. Many different species live in wet soil. Some of them are parasites. They can be either plant parasites or animal parasites. Many of them are very common human parasites. They're parasites of our pets and livestock. Some of them are parasites of insects, which can make them a valuable control if you're trying to control one of these insects that they feed upon. And others are parasites of other various vertebrates. Now, many of the species that feed on plants are extremely small. Here you see a picture of a nematode as compared to a piece of cotton thread. And you can see the nematode is much, much thinner than a piece of thread. Here are some examples of different nematodes that are human and animal parasites. Some of the animal parasitic nematodes are also called helminths. There are intestinal worms, the guinea worm, the eye worm, heartworm. Many of these are major problems in third world nations, not so much in the United States. But if any of you have ever gotten a puppy or a kitten and you have to take it to the veterinarian to get it dewormed, whether it has roundworms, flatworms, whatever it might be, many of these are actually nematodes. As a general rule, most nematodes fall into several different types or major classes. We have free-living nematodes, many of which live in the soil. A lot of them are saprophytes, which means they just feed on decaying organic matter. Some of them feed on bacteria in the soil. Others feed on fungi in the soil. Some nematodes are predaceous, which means they feed on other nematodes. So obviously, if you have a pest nematode and you're able to add or encourage predaceous nematodes, that could be a bonus. Others are entomopathogenic nematodes. What this is nematodes that feed on insects. Like I mentioned earlier, some of them have actually been classified, separated, raised, and are now available for sale to be added to a garden to help control different insect problems. And then other ones that we would normally deal with are plant parasitic nematodes that feed on plants, primarily plant roots, but not always. Many of the free-living nematodes are actually beneficial in the garden. Like I mentioned earlier, some of them can be saprophytic, which means they feed on dead or decaying plant material. Some are fungivores, which means they feed on fungi in the soil. Other ones are bacteriophores and feed on bacteria in the soil. So when they're feeding on either fungi or bacteria, they're consuming either beneficial species or it might be a plant parasitic or pest species. How these nematodes operate is they have a mouthpiece that's essentially like a shop vac. They just go through the soil, basically sucking up bacteria or sucking up fungi for food. They can play a vital role in the food web as far as nutrient recycling goes and as secondary decomposers. So when you're building a compost pile, when you're looking at having plant material turn into organic matter, the primary decomposers would be the bacteria and fungi, and then nematodes can come along and aid with that decomposition. They could become important indicator organisms. So if you have your soil tested and you have a large number of different harmless free living nematodes, it indicates that you have a very healthy soil. If you have a very low number of these nematodes, it may be an indication that you have a very unhealthy soil. And like I mentioned, many of these nematodes are beneficial to agriculture, beneficial to plants, and a very important part of a healthy garden soil. There are predaceous nematodes, which means that these nematodes feed on other pest nematodes. One of the most common species or genus is going to be Mononchus. And here's a little video right here of one of these nematodes in the soil. And you see he's crawling along looking for some food source. He finds another pest nematode, grabs a hold of him, and consumes them. So like I said, in healthy garden soil, you're going to have a lot of different organisms there, and predaceous nematodes are a very important part. Other free-living nematodes are a very important part for recycling nutrients. But here we have a predaceous nematode actually performing a beneficial service in the garden by eating a pest nematode. Certain other species of nematodes have become very important biocontrol agents. These are entomopathogenic nematodes, which means that they feed on insects. Some of the different species have been actually packaged and sold to control mole crickets and many other soil-dwelling insect pests. The main genera of the nematodes that are used for this are Steinernema and Heterohabditis. So on the right hand side you see a picture of a beetle grub in the soil. On the left is a healthy larva. On the right hand side is one that was infected with one of these species of nematodes. What the nematodes do is they enter inside the insect grub, feed on it from the inside, and kill it. So some of these can be very important biological controls. But unfortunately, we do have certain nematodes that are plant parasitic nematodes in the garden. These are organisms that either inhabit the rhizosphere of plants, which means that they stay on the outside of the root and feed on it. Other ones can actually enter inside the root and feed on it from the inside. What this does is it causes root damage that can lead to reduced vigor, wilting, reduction in growth, and economic yield. All plant parasitic nematodes have a mouthpiece with a stylet. A stylet is like basically a large hypodermic needle that they use to pierce the root cuticle and then remove the cell contents. So nematodes have a piercing sucking type of mouthpart that they use to poke into the root and actually extract the water and nutrients from the root, and in that way they damage the root. What this kind of root damage can do above ground is it causes general chlorosis. Chlorosis means that the leaves turn from a normal green to yellow. Necrosis. Necrosis means that the leaves actually turn brown and die. Necrosis means death. They cause wilting and intraveinal chlorosis in leaves. They cause stunting, toppling, and lodging of plants. In a large field where vegetables are being grown, they'll cause patchiness in field situations because nematodes are never distributed evenly throughout a grower's field or a vegetable garden. They're going to be in little patches. So here and there you're going to have plants that are not doing well and struggling. They can cause dieback in trees, beginning with the terminal tip of the tree. And then sometimes their feeding will cause sudden death in a plant. Seemingly overnight, the plant will go from healthy to dead. Below ground, some of the damage that plant parasitic nematodes can cause is root knotting. The most common garden plant parasitic nematode is the root knot nematode. What this is a very pronounced swelling of the root tissue due to the damage that's been caused by the nematode. Nematodes can cause lesions to the roots, which is an injury, a wound, or a spot of infected tissue. And nematodes can also cause necrosis or death of the root cells and entire roots underground. Here on the left, we see an example of root knots on a plant. Sometimes if you have vegetables, especially tomatoes, peppers, and okra, if you've ever tried growing them, the plant will begin to wilt and die. You dig the plant up, you look at the roots. The roots are unusually thick, swollen, they have large bumps or root knots on them. What's causing this is the nematodes, like you see on the right, that have attached to the roots, begun laying eggs on the roots. When they feed on the roots, they release enzymes into the root, which causes it to swell and be disfigured. This kind of damage also damages the root so that it's not able to take up water and nutrients properly, which is what causes the above ground wilting of the plant. Here are some general above ground symptoms of root knot nematode feeding in a grower's field. You see the yellowing or chlorosis in the field. In the upper right hand side, the field distribution. Some of the plants will be doing well, other plants and groups will not be doing very well. Causes yellowing, wilting because the roots have been damaged and now they're unable to take up water properly. And then in the bottom right hand corner, you can see a plant that was pulled up and you can actually see the root galling symptoms on the root. Root knot nematodes have a huge host range. There's over 5,000 different plant species that are suitable hosts for root knot nematodes. It's an obligate parasite, which means it's always a parasite, always feeds on living plants. It is considered the most harmful plant parasitic nematode. There's more than 80 different specific species of root knot nematodes that have been described. And sometimes when they begin to infect plants and start damaging the roots, at first there's no apparent above ground symptoms, but eventually once the problem becomes more advanced, the plants will all of a sudden overnight start to show symptoms and die. Here's another common plant parasitic nematode in Florida called a lesion nematode. Here's a picture of one. You see at the one end is the head, and it's going to have the stylet mouth part inside like a hypodermic needle. Lesion nematodes will feed on the outside of the plant's roots and basically scrape it to feed on it and cause a lot of damage. Sometimes the damage they cause, the open wounds, provide a very ideal way for plant problem bacteria and fungi to enter into the plant's roots. With lesion nematodes, there's over 70 different species that have been described. They can attack over 400 different types of host plants, so they have a very wide host range also. Lesion nematodes can overwinter in root debris. They're migratory endoparasites, which means that they can survive feeding on plant roots or just traveling around in the soil. They're considered the third worst nematode pest in the world. They can interact with fungi to increase the disease pressure. So when they feed on the plant's roots, they can actually introduce pest fungi into the roots to cause kind of a 1-2 punch on the plant. And they can cause root necrosis and then plant death. Another important nematode pest that we have here in Florida is the sting nematode. When this nematode feeds on plant roots, it actually snips off pieces of the plant root. So on the left-hand side here, you see the plant roots on the far left are obviously much smaller, shorter. They look like they've been snipped off as compared with the plant roots right next to it. When they feed on carrots or other root crops, they damage them and injure them so that they won't grow right. They start sending out secondary roots and they're stunted and damaged. Sting nematodes can be very destructive on a wide range of plants. They're actually one of the larger plant parasitic nematodes. They can grow as long as 3 millimeters, so they're going to be large enough where they're actually visible to the naked eye, whereas almost all the other plant nematodes are much smaller. You actually need a microscope to be able to see them. They're typically only found in very sandy soil environments, so you're not going to find them in soils that have a high percentage of clay or muck soils, and they could be a major turf pest. Another fairly large nematode pest that we have here in Florida is the lance nematode. Some lance nematodes can become a major pest of turf grass, and the damage they cause is just general plant death in patches, which makes it very difficult to diagnose because the damage they cause looks very similar to what might be caused by chinch bugs or other problems. Lance nematodes are also fairly large at 1.5 millimeters long. Like I mentioned, it could be a major pest of certain agronomic crops and also turf. It depends on the exact species. They're right behind sting nematodes as one of the worst nematode pests of turf grass here in Florida. And the problem is the damage they cause looks very nondescript. So it can be very, very easily confused with chinch bug damage or maybe a fungus in the lawn. A lot of times it's very difficult to diagnose just from visual symptoms that a nematode is the actual pest problem. Stubby root nematodes are also a problem here in Florida. And they got their name from the type of damage that they cause to plants. Here on the right hand side you can see some damaged corn roots, and these nematodes will snip the roots off and make them look stubby or stunted. This nematode can be a major problem to commercial growers because it helps to transmit viruses also. It's a major vector of the corky ring spot virus, which is a problem with potatoes. You see pictured here on the left. There are several other types of plant parasitic nematodes that you probably wouldn't normally encounter here in Florida. There's a few species of foliar nematodes, nematodes that actually crawl up a plant stem and feed on the leaves. They're not normally encountered here. There are pinewood and red ring nematodes. Pinewood nematodes are a major pest of pine trees in other states and other countries. Red ring nematodes are a major pest of coconut palm trees, to a certain extent in South Florida, but mostly in the Caribbean and other tropical countries. And cyst nematodes are a huge problem in other parts of the country. They mostly feed on soybeans and a couple other crops that we generally don't grow here in Florida. So if you have a problem with nematodes, if you have root knot nematodes that are feeding on your vegetable plants or other nematodes that are feeding on your turf, what can you do? There's really very few chemical controls that are labeled for the home garden and landscape use. The only current options are really cultural controls. For certain crops, planting resistant cultivars will help. Using cover crops can help. Adding organic matter a lot of times really helps because root knot nematodes and other species of nematodes really prefer very sandy soil. So building up your soil with a lot of organic matter is just going to make it much less attractive to them. Adjusting your planting times, because some of these nematodes are the most active when it's very hot during the summer outdoors. So trying to plant in a slightly cooler time of year helps. And then proper crop destruction and weed management helps also. Sometimes in the garden, even if you've removed your crop, these nematodes will move to the weeds and be able to overwinter or oversummer in the weeds, so the next time you plant the next crop, they'll move from the weeds back into your crop. So keeping on top of weeds can really help to remove the nematodes from your garden so they won't come back quite as quickly in the future. One way that you can help discourage plant parasitic nematodes in the home garden is through soil solarization. This is where during the summer you completely clear out your garden, remove all the weeds, remove all the plants, turn the soil over, water it lightly just to get it moist, and then cover it with clear plastic for 1 to 3 months. What this does is the sun will shine through the clear plastic and heat up the soil, and then the plastic helps to hold the heat in like an oven effect, and it will heat the soil up ideally to about 160 degrees close to the surface. What this heat does is it will kill weed seeds, it will kill a certain number of nematodes, and then drive the rest of them away. They'll go either much deeper into the soil or off to the sides out of your garden, and can help reduce number of soil-borne fungi problems with your plants also. It doesn't remove or kill or drive away nematodes forever, but by doing this you can drive the nematodes away for at least a few months. So when you remove the plastic and put your fall crop in, you'll be able to plant, grow, and harvest your plants without any nematode problems. Hopefully this has given you a good introduction into nematodes that we deal with in agriculture. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Feel free to contact me or write your questions down and ask them in class, because a lot of times if you're wondering about something, everybody else is wondering the same thing also. Thank you very much.